If we don't want our postmodern and democratic societies where everyone has a say to fall apart, what we need is to get everyone generally educated, or what the Germans call Bildung. Bildung is knowledge about self, society, and nature, but it's not so much specific knowledge, it's much more orientational knowledge of where you would have to look if you truly wanted to know something. What we also need is to create fail-safes and make sure that whatever individual perspectives we come up with, they actually truly live up to the complexity of the problems at hand. We need everyone to get on a lifelong and cumulative path of learning. But what happens instead is that most of us end up on plateaus, in personal and professional life actually. My observation has been that after a very steep learning curve of say the first 3 to 5 years of taking up a new endeavor, we basically end up repeating the same mental patterns that we've learned. We're not really challenged into developing, but we're surrounded mostly by noise, and stimuli that don't really stimulate us to get further in our development. But we are not left alone with this. We can actually make use of collective intelligence to find the next idea or the next practice which will help us make the next step. The traditional way of doing this is obviously institutions such as the universities, but unfortunately they don't come up with personalized knowledge, but rather impersonal facts that no one really overlooks. And embodied approaches, on the other hand, like small communities, don't scale well, and they also are not very good at covering all the necessary details to know something really well. What I'll then suggest is to make use of digital tools to help us find the next idea or the next practice which will help us develop personally and professionally. Now, our goal is not to replace these established practices with digital tools, but to use these digital tools to make transparent what already happens in these learning spaces. The goal is to make transparent the genesis of your perspective, how you get to your results. You've certainly seen these YouTube videos where leading musicians not only share their results, but they share how they get at their results. I'm talking about hour-long podcasts where they describe in detail their actual process of creation. The goal is to make transparent, in other words, the depth of your perspective and that which you have truly to say. There are endlessly many practices that could be digitized, everything from reading, learning, to discussions. I will focus on annotations in the following though, because I think for most of us, the connection between annotations and Bildung might not be very obvious. Annotations have been studied forever, basically since hermeneutics, the science of understanding, exists, and annotations help us create markers for those passages in books that will be most likely relevant for our own personal development. Let me show you an example how annotations could be digitized. The project that I want to show you is the Memex. You go to getmemex.com and download the plugin for your browser. What the Memex allows you to do is to basically annotate anything that you read on the web. I have installed the plugin and opened the Memex web page on Wikipedia, where Vannevar Bush's idea, which is almost a century old now, is being described. And what I can do now with the help of the tool is I can highlight any passage I want, and I can also annotate any passage I want by just marking it and adding an annotation. These annotations I can basically store and share with others. I can then export them as well for my other tools where I can then create an article out of these annotations. Now, do you see any kind of developmental educational implications of the Memex? Let's have a look at the team, at what they think the developmental potential is of the Memex. They actually built it to battle misinformation. And they want to do this by providing warm data. Warm data is the kind of information that we gain by learning by proxy. By learning from people that we trust, we gain knowledge that is personally relevant to us. And what they want to provide us with is a system of free exchange of such shared truths and such warm data. And as they say, emergent truth comes from warm data and not from hard facts. Or in an example they use, imagine you could use the Memex to see which the most favorite passages to Elon Musk are when you want to learn about artificial intelligence instead of hitting artificial intelligence in Google. It's an entirely different way of learning by following your idols and the people that you trust. Now imagine that we put the Memex on steroids and added some further features to it. One of which is to be able to add different types of highlights. In the literature on close reading, it is suggested to have at least half a dozen different kinds of highlights and use different colors or use different symbols to represent them. For example, it must be visible whether something is an outstanding idea to you or whether you think it's a major claim for the argumentation but it's not something that you would actually quote. You must also be able to distinguish this from incomprehensible passages that you cannot make sense of, and from passages which you don't agree with or think are factually wrong. This is the bare minimum of distinctions that we need if you want to highlight an annotated piece of text. In the literature on close reading, it's also suggested to take different resolutions when making annotations to a text. Different resolutions which range from a very high resolution detailed perspective of taking something apart, criticizing it, pointing to alternative points of view, and taking a very low resolution big picture on it to see the overall argument and what the author actually tries to convey. And you can do this by adding abstracts which give you the low resolution picture, by adding chapter outlines, paragraph outlines. You can also add keyword lists. It's nothing but a list that basically shows you the overall flow of the argument and the overall topics that are being raised. And you can also add self-assessment questions, which students usually use to prepare for their exams. And their value is that they focus you on the factual content of what is being said in a book. That's why students usually start by learning the assessment questions before they usually read a text. You can also add an analytic index. An analytic index is nothing but a list of page numbers where you have the major arguments enveloping each other, so how they follow from each other, which gives you an overview of the overall argument of a piece. And apart from these general orientational suggestions that we made so far, the following features would have text expanding value. For example, to suggest catchphrases to express an idea of the author. Sometimes the reader can actually come up with a better way of expressing something than the author did. In many cases this actually happens. Imagine if you could add this to a text. Imagine if you could add an explanation or a clarification, go into detail. By knowing other passages of the author, you could actually explain what the other tried to convey, because sometimes, again, the reader is in a better position of explaining something and making something comprehensible than the author. You could also take alternative perspectives. You could point out different works that disagree with the author's perspective and offer an alternative view. So by annotating a passage, you could immediately show that there are 10 different alternatives views that you could take and immediately point to the actual works where you could follow them up. Imagine if you then simply could create links to other sources that would allow you to look at things in a different way. Now let's turn to the orientational value of the Memex. What the Memex does is basically to digitize the human practice of annotations. Annotations have been there with us forever. We've been doing it forever. But what the Memex helps us with is to make these annotations easily shareable and to run these annotations through algorithms. The algorithms can then help us to make visible the most impactful ideas. For what reason? The most interesting ideas, the most innovative ideas, but as well the most difficult to grasp ideas and the most problematic views. And that's basically the idea behind the Memex, the way Vannevar Bush envisioned it. He literally imagined a kind of machine on top of your head that is recording every learning step that you make. Now, this machine is not simply copying the textbook that you're reading, but it's recording your learning experience. This is what is significant to you as a learner. That is what is being recorded by the Memex. And the idea is to provide a general orientation of what the most successful paths are that people take through a text. This is how we've been reading texts forever. We don't read texts by starting with page 1 and ending with the last page, but usually we hear one example from significant others that introduces us to a work, then we start reading a chapter that might interest us. This is how we develop our perspective, and this is how we gain personalized knowledge. This is precisely what the Memex does. It makes visible the most impactful ideas and how they are impactful on people, whether they agree with them or they disagree with them. It would also be the most immediate feedback to the authors themselves, because they could immediately see how they influence their readers with their texts, what remains not comprehended, They might even get suggestions how to phrase things better, or even factual suggestions to get their facts right.